All right, everyone. So we're going to go over this next chapter here, which is chapter 9, and then section 1 from chapter 13. And this is going over labor market trends. So we're going to look at employment, what that is defined as in the study of economics, and then also looking at different trends, including what our economy is as far as a service versus manufacturing versus agrarian type of economy. And so what you're looking at here ultimately as this picture is bread lines during the Great Depression. And so this is definitely looking at a downturn in the economy. And ultimately, when you talk about a depression as compared to a recession in economics, a recession is looking at multiple quarters, maybe two back-to-back quarters that are showing a downturn in the economy. And then a depression is compounding that. So it's a continuous recession. And so ultimately, we're going to look at these different trends. And you can watch this video, or you can even go and look in the chapters to complete the Google form. So with the United States labor force, as far as employment goes, when you're defining this term, it's really looking at people who are at least 16 years old, and you have to meet one of the following requirements. You have to work at least 1 hour of pay within the last week, and this is the official definition that is being used, or you have worked at least 15 or more hours without pay in a family business. Now, technically speaking, if you are age 14, you are allowed to work in a family business, but you would not be included in the definition of employment. And then ultimately, when we look at jobs in general, employment helps look, and it says they help jobs but did not work due to illness, vacation, labor disputes, or bad weather. These individuals would also be considered employed. And ultimately, you have to compare this to what unemployment is. And when you look at employment specifically within the United States, you really want to make sure that you look at both of these trends, both what is the current employment, and we'll look at this further. And then within the unemployment sector, really what you're looking at is someone who is also at least 16 years old. And so to consider someone unemployed is they do not have a job and they are actively searching for a job. So if you're sitting at home just, eating Cheetos on your couch and not looking for a job, you're not considered unemployed. You are out of the job market. And so that's, again, just being more specific with defining what employment is and then what unemployment is. And when you talk about someone who is unemployed, again, the definition here is they are actively searching for work. Now, when you look at trends within the United States, our economy has shifted a couple of different times. And really what we look at is in the founding of our country, we were on sort of the crux of the second industrial revolution. Talk about the market revolution, especially in the northern states in the early part of our nation. And even with the intention perhaps of Thomas Jefferson purchasing Louisiana for the sake of having a greater agrarian contribution, there was this industrialization that occurred within the United States. And so ultimately our economy shifted from more agricultural and then more industrial. And even this is a considerable factor within the American Civil War in the mid-19th century. And really, another thing that we see in the change in our economy is really since, the 2000s is the dot-com era, as they call it. And really with computer chips, so much can be done within the economy where at this point, a job or a career that you guys may want may not even exist right now because of how quickly things have changed. And this is really what we're looking at, more of shifts in the economy, starting agrarian, then becoming more industrialized, and then specific with things like computer chips. And ultimately, what we see within our nation is we are creating, manufacturing fewer goods, and we have a greater service economy. Now, when you define the occupations within an economy, what we're looking at is what types of jobs make up the American economy. So this has shifted from manufacturing, and this has moved into more service. And truly, the greatest export of the United States is perhaps culture. And when we see the increase in service jobs, it really is at the cost of the manufacturing jobs. And so to kind of bring this back to our early discussion of just economic terms, the trade-off of having more service jobs is is you lose out on having those manufacturing jobs. And ultimately, what we see is there's this increased demand in skilled labor, and this is perhaps part of the service component of this. So, even an example is as a teacher, I am providing a very specific service, and that service, in order for me to even be a public educator, I have to go through a certain expectation of schooling. And ultimately, what happens is when you have greater demand for skilled labor, people ideally will make choices to become skilled in order to meet that demand for those jobs. And so one thing you could say is, like working at like a car manufacturing plant in Detroit used to pay, the best wage in town. And then ultimately, when we move away from that manufacturing into service economy, those jobs aren't as in high demand, and ultimately other jobs will become in more high demand. This is really looking at just our economy in general. And so you can see specifically the service aspect of the economy, which was really high even in the early part of the 20th century, really has drastically increased over time over the last 100 years. Same thing with agriculture. You can see that going down. Same thing with manufacturing, and then mining as well. And so because these things are going down and the service going up, ultimately we will import a lot of these different things. And so the service is perhaps acquiring these different types of sectors. Now, when you talk about the change in our labor force in general, when you look at a college graduate, basically we look at the economic principle is that if you have more education, the earning potential that you have is increasing. And so this graph is kind of showing that trend, that the likelihood of earning a higher income is demonstrated based on the amount of education that one achieves. And so this learning effect really is that the theory that education increases productivity and results in higher wages is ultimately why you talk about going to college as an investment. You may lose out on wages because you're having to go to school and you cannot work, and you may go into debt for that degree, but ultimately the earning potential of that job vastly outweighs not obtaining that education. So that we call that the learning effect. And then there's also this somewhat psychological component of economics here. The screening effect is really when employers are looking at your resume, when they see that you have completed a college degree, it may not directly translate to the job description itself, but it demonstrates that you having a college degree, that you are hardworking, that you started a project and you were able to complete a project, and it does demonstrate a level of intelligence as well. Now, the other thing that we see is, to a certain degree, women were not a part of the working economy, other than perhaps like the cottage industry, which did change with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And with women in work, really, we saw a huge influx of women, especially during World War II. Unfortunately, when the men came back from war, they sort of took those jobs back. But really, what we see is a dramatic increase of women in the workplace. And the nice thing too that we're seeing is diversification within the different jobs. A lot of women were only expected to perhaps be elementary school teachers and things like that, and then maybe a secretary, which we call an administrative assistant now. These types of jobs were the only ones available to women, and of course this is changing as well. And ultimately, when you talk about the actual economy itself, I mean, women make up a great deal of the economy, which perhaps was not the same even 100 years ago. Now you talk about temporary employment. So here's BJ Scott's Ryan the Temp. And ultimately, when you talk about a temp employee, this is someone who is part-time. And so the contingency of this employment is that you are completing a task, perhaps for a couple months or something like that. And then an agency would actually help you find that job. And so if you own a business, you can request that a temp agency hire someone and they will come in. And basically the benefit of having this is you can have flexible work arrangements. So perhaps as a business, you're trying to conduct an inventory. So perhaps you will bring a temporary employee on. It's also easy to discharge them. Ultimately, when you hire someone, you take on a considerable amount of risk, and you cannot discharge that person unless you have cause. Otherwise, they'll be able to accept unemployment And so ultimately, when you look at the discharge of a temp employee, they're signing up for that job with the understanding that this will not be a permanent position. And then the other thing that you see is with temporary employment in general, there aren't benefits usually offered. And when you talk about the time that they're paid for, it's usually less money than you would if you work directly for that company and perhaps were hired as a more permanent employee. Now, when you talk about the supply and demand component of this in the labor market, so the labor demand, the higher the wage rate, the smaller the quantity of labor demanded by firms and the government. And so ultimately, when you talk about the demand, companies can only afford a certain amount and they're only willing or able to pay a certain amount. And so that's where the demand comes in. And then as far as the supply, when you talk about the increase in the wage, um, people are going to want to work that job, and so perhaps they may acquire the employment necessary to become a part of that labor supply. And then the other thing that we see is the equilibrium here is the wage set by the employer can't be too much so that they're not making a profit, but it can't be so low that the quality of the employee that they're getting does not satisfy the job requirements. And so when we look at the equilibrium wage, the wage rate that produces neither an excess supply nor an excess demand in workers. And so when you look at the equilibrium paid, this means that the employer is satisfied with the wage that they're giving the employee because they're able to stay in business and make a considerable amount of profit. And the worker is satisfied as well because ultimately they're able to earn a decent wage. And perhaps you could look at this when you talk about Henry Ford opening his manufacturing plant. He actually paid the workers a considerable amount more than what the market was set at. Obviously, the work was very menial and boring. But with that, you have satisfied workers. And so the labor supply comes in because the wage is increasing. So you have a greater demand for those jobs. And ultimately, Henry Ford is satisfied because he has full employees and they're very easy to replace. Now, when you talk about wages, what we look at in economics is wage is typically connected to your skill level and your education. And these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but one example of this is just unskilled labor. And really just defined as not needing any specialized skills. This is something that perhaps, it's not that you don't have any skills, but they're perhaps easy to teach, may not take much time, may take you a week or two as far as training or perhaps a couple days. And so when we look at this, this is really unskilled labor is the easiest to replace because of the lack of training necessary to complete the job. And then you look at something like a semi-skilled labor, you do need some sort of perhaps certificate, even like a specific license that would allow you to drive a forklift or something like this. But technically this one is you would say relative more skilled than or more specialized than unskilled, but less than your skilled labor. And so skilled is really where you do have a trade. You do have some sort of certificate where you're showing a specific trade. So this is something like an auto mechanic or a plumber, or electrician. And then to add on to the last kind of trend here is with professional labor, this is ultimately where you have what's considered an advanced skill. And so lawyers, doctors, teachers, these are individuals that require extensive education, years upon years of education in order to even begin that job, let alone mobility within that job market. But ultimately, you want to understand how to differentiate between the types of labor and understand that there is a connection between the amount of skill or education involved and the wage. The lower the skill, the lesser the wage, the higher the skill, the higher the wage. Now, within the wage itself, when you talk about wage discrimination, we're really looking at men and women, perhaps as two demographics, doing the exact same job, the exact same duties, but being paid a different amount of money. And so Congress has stepped in on numerous occasions to combat this wage discrimination, especially when you talk about the rise of feminist wave during the 1960s. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 is a good example, which is a federal use of labor intervention in order to create equality in the workplace. And then when you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's a specific component in there that does talk about with hiring, and that's really what the Civil Rights Act was about, was segregation with hiring practices, and that's specifically what Title VII is of that act. And then when you talk about specifically pay levels for women, you do have these even federal protections, but ultimately American women today do earn about 75% of what men earn. This number does fluctuate, but the main thing to understand really is that this discrimination does occur. The degree to which it occurs, I think, is a matter of debate, but understand that it is still something that is substantiated by labor statistics. And when you look at the pay levels specifically for minorities, this is something that can potentially be a wage discrimination type of issue as well. And so with wage discrimination, just like other discrimination, perhaps based on race or sex or sexual orientation, it does also occur based on your wage. And this is ultimately how we use to look at socioeconomic levels. Now, when you look at the trend in general, we do have labor unions, and we'll get into some specifics about that too. But ultimately, a labor union exists to improve the conditions of the workers. And ultimately, we don't see a ton of employees within the American economy a part of labor unions. And ultimately, labor union participation has gone down in general. So why? Why have we seen this? Well, one thing that we have seen is these right to work laws. And ultimately, this means that you are not allowed to even have a union within a state. And what example we see, so teachers, usually belong to a union and have usually pretty strong union collective bargaining powers. But Arizona is a good example of a right to work state, where you ultimately do not need to pay union dues and you negotiate your contract on your own. And this is potentially, a double-edged sword. It's a benefit for the worker in the regards that you are able to negotiate your salary if you are adept in doing that. But also there can be some abuse on the administration and district side as well. And ultimately what we see is unions have been within the manufacturing sector, and this is fighting for shorter work weeks, shorter work days, better working conditions, breaks and vacations, sick days, things like that. And when you talk about the fulfillment of union goals, so many of the unions have worked really since the start of the Industrial Revolution to combat some ills created by the factory owners and business owners and things like that. But ultimately, we see a decline in union membership because a lot of the goals that the unions fought for have been accomplished. And that's what I mentioned with like the 40-hour work week, 8-hour work day. You have a mandatory lunch, mandatory 15-minute break, things like that. Now, when you talk about powers of a union, what is the union able to do? Well, they have what's called the ability to collectively bargain. And what they're looking for is, with the power of the union, they will work on behalf of the employees, and they're going to work with the actual business owners and work on what we look at as wages, which is the amount of money you're paid, and then ultimately the different benefits. So how much money do you get paid if you do overtime? What are the scheduled raises perhaps, and then medical benefits, retirement, things like that. And so really the collective bargaining ability is the powers. It's like the superpowers of the union itself. And so they're going to fight for wages. They're going to fight for safe working conditions. And then the other thing that they may fight for is looking at job security. And so really when you look at a union in general, it is an ability to make sure that people are able to work. And so ultimately something that can happen is when you don't have a union fighting for you, there could be arbitrary firing of workers and layoffs and things like that. And so the union is really as kind of a champion for the workers, for the employees. Now, as far as the collective bargaining, that's kind of the fight for for these ideas. And really, it's a negotiation done at a conference table, perhaps. But sometimes that doesn't work. And so, really, the union will recommend to its employees that they should go on strike. And ultimately, a strike is meaning that you are stopping work. You are required to be at work, but you are not showing up to work. And you may picket, which is with the signs and things like that, in order to raise attention to it. But ultimately, the union may ask its members to vote on the strike, and then they will vote. And so, when you talk about like the LA Unified Teachers Strike, they're claiming needing smaller class sizes, higher wages, better benefits, things like that. And so a strike can be very detrimental to the cause. It isn't always effective. And then when you look at something like a teacher strike, you look at the optics of teachers not teaching their students, and perhaps it can bring a negativity within the community that is hard to overcome. Strikes are generally avoided as much as possible. Now, one thing that can happen is a mediation, and this is really, instead of going on strike, is you can kind of bring a neutral mediator to come in and arbitrate between the two, and ultimately they can be the one to like make sure they look at both sides. And ultimately, a mediation can happen after a strike as well, but usually mediation is used to prevent a strike. And then a last way that you can deal with strikes and settlements is, if the mediation doesn't work, you can go into what's called arbitration, which is when a third party comes in and they will decide what happens. If you're a baseball fan, when you talk about players going into arbitration, they try and make a deal with the team that they have been drafted by, that have been in the minor league system, but ultimately the team and the player cannot come to an agreement. So they set it up to arbitration, and a board within the Major League Baseball committee will decide, okay, this is a fair wage for that player. So getting into more of the unemployment component of this, there are several different types of unemployment. And when you look at this specifically with frictional unemployment, this is more of a chosen transition. With economics, we're looking at how people make choices. And so this may be someone who you just graduated from college, and you want to get a job right after. You have a business degree, but you're going to take some time because you really want to find the right position. Now, you are considered unemployed because you're over the age of 16 and you are actively searching for a job, but it's frictional unemployment because you could take a job. It's not that you don't have an option of a job. You're just looking for the right one. And that's that frictional definition. Now, the structural unemployment is more of a systemic issue within the economy. And this is really where you have certain skills, but there's no job available for those skills. And this is pretty common when you talk about someone who has perhaps a lot of education, maybe like a master's in anthropology, but there aren't really very many jobs within the marketplace. But also, structural unemployment can occur when a job becomes obsolete too. Not that it's necessarily a lot of skills, but we don't really see a lot of milkmen today or things like that. And then when you talk about a seasonal unemployment, this is usually where we can predict that this is going to happen, where some industries will slow down or seasonal shifts in their production schedules. And so you could look at this perhaps with retail, and how there's going to be perhaps seasonal unemployment during off seasons, but then more people when it comes to like Black Friday and holiday shopping. And then the other thing that we see is, in general, when we look at employment as a trend, there will always be upturns and downturns as far as unemployment. And unemployment is very dynamic and is continually changing, and is an ebb and flow type of feel. And so when you look at the cyclical unemployment, this is kind of taken as a caveat when you're trying to determine the unemployment rate within a nation or within an economy. Now, when you're trying to figure out the unemployment rate, ultimately the unemployment rate, more than the stock market, more than a lot of other metrics, is the best way to figure out sort of how well the economy is doing. And when you look at this, it's usually it's the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics that compiles all of this information, and they're the ones that will ultimately release the different unemployment numbers. And when you look at an unemployment rate, it's just defined as the percentage of a nation's labor force that is unemployed. And again, when we look at unemployed, you are over the age of 16, you do not have a job, but you are actively searching for a job. So to say it a different way, the unemployment rate is simply the number or the percentage of the people within the country that do not have a job that are actively searching for one. And ultimately, when you look at this, it's only a national average. You can talk about local unemployment percentages, unemployment rates, but really you look at this as a national economy, and the unemployment rate is a national figure. So when you talk about full employment, this is when, because you can't ever have 0% unemployment. That's just impossible. And so when you look at full employment, you say that this is when the unemployment rate is between 4 and 6%. And ultimately, since the beginning of the Trump administration, this has really become into a full employment situation. Obviously, this is perhaps changing right now with things going on with coronavirus. But ultimately, this 4 to 6% is something that we have been sustaining and maintaining for the last several years here. But understand that sometimes people are considered what's called underemployed. And underemployed is where you have a job, but ultimately the qualifications that you have, the skills that you have are not being realized. So perhaps you're a mechanic and a trained mechanic, but you can only get a job perhaps working at the front at CVS, right? So you are still employed, but it's not a full employment because ultimately your skills are not being utilized within the economy. Now, one thing to look at as far as a current tie-in is this graphic here is showing really, so the loss and it's May 2020, and we're looking at in the last month really the working population of 25 states has been lost, and so the unemployment right now is difficult to calculate because the actual numbers are not necessarily being reported to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But the highest we've ever seen unemployment in the United States hovered on an average around 25% during the Great Depression. But understand that when we are calculating these terms, what we're really looking at is we are striving for full employment. We are looking for a 4 to 6%, but anything under 10% is really an economy working at this full level. If you have any questions, please send me an email, let me know, and go ahead and fill out the Google form.